Hello and welcome to this podcast from the Professional Practices and Financial Services team here at Safri. My name is Jamie Lane. I'm a partner and head of the group based in our Bournemouth office. Today, I've got the pleasure of being joined by Clare Morgan, who is our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Senior Manager at the firm, and she's based in our London office. So let me tell you a little bit about Clare and her background. So Clare's a specialist in the area of equality, diversity and inclusion, and we'll refer to it as ED&I throughout our podcast, as that's what it's commonly known or abbreviated to. She has an academic background in post-colonial politics and professional background in international development, working most recently with global movements on gender equality. Clare applies her expertise of global inequalities into a workplace setting and draws on her own lived experiences as an employee to help organisations understand the positive impact their ED&I commitments can have on individuals, on businesses, and also on society more broadly. So what are we going to talk about today? So in this episode, we're going to be discussing why diversity and inclusion is important to professional services firms. We'll cover areas including why a firm-wide ED&I strategy is crucial to success, the relationship between a firm's culture and ED&I, and the role of senior management to drive change, common challenges that professional services businesses face, and how an inclusive culture can help with business critical issues such as recruitment and retention of staff, which I know in my client base are pretty hot topics at the moment. So welcome, Clare.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you.
Nice to meet you, Jamie.
So I suppose let's kick off with ED&I is a relatively new, job role within a professional services business, but also something that strategically has probably made it onto the board's, strategic agenda over the last few years. Perhaps we could just kick off with you talking about where we've got to effectively in professional services businesses and what ED&I is, in that setting.
Okay. Well, I just as a start, then I guess ED&I, equality, diversity, inclusion, or sometimes referred to as equity, diversity, and inclusion, is really where businesses are trying to look at the diverse makeup of their business. So how diverse or how not diverse are we along different lines, whether that's around ethnicity or gender, socioeconomic background, usually along the 9 protected characteristics. So how diverse are we? And what's our culture like? How inclusive is it? So does everyone have a voice? Is everyone able to speak up in our business? How inclusive are we? And if inclusion is done well, I would say that you're then starting to work towards a space of equality. So whilst, and this is where the word equality and equity are used in this space, sometimes people use it interchangeably, but actually they're quite different. So I think traditionally businesses have taken an equal approach in their work, where they've said, look, we give everyone the same thing when they get here. Everyone's treated the same, and then the outcomes are different. And why is that? And that's partly because you need to take an equitable approach where you're actually looking at, well, what are the different needs of people? So it's acknowledging that people don't have the same starting point, that people need to be treated more individually and in correspondence to their particular needs. And when you take an equitable approach, you're more likely then to be able to build a more inclusive culture in your business. And the benefits of that is that you then have those diverse perspectives coming into the space. You're mitigating things like groupthink, you're more innovative, people are happier. Well-being is improved, it's part of well-being, people feel a sense of belonging, so your attrition rates drop, people stick around, all that kind of thing. We'll touch on some of that later, but essentially that's what ED&I is about for many businesses. Was there a second part to your question, Jamie?
So I suppose so that's ED&I. Define what it is in a professional services space for those people listening. Perhaps explain what your take is on where professional services businesses are at the moment, and maybe
yes.
Compared to corporates, for instance.
Sure. I think we're coming at looking at ED&I in a professional services space perhaps later than a lot of other organisations and businesses as a sector. I mean, it's been at least a couple of decades. There's people who I work with in the ED&I sort of professional space who've been working on ED&I for decades. They acknowledged that it wasn't always called that, but essentially looking at diversity, looking at inclusion in a workplace setting for a long time. But McKinsey research, I would say, has been a big help and seen a big shift in people recognizing the business case for ED&I. So McKinsey research since 2014 have been tracing the impact on being more diverse and inclusive in the workplace and the impact on the bottom line. So whilst it's not a causational connection, we can't get into that much detail with it, the correlation is really strong and that evidence is building. So I would say, in a way, the jury's out on whether there's a business case, whether it affects profit and the bottom line. I think we can agree that we're at a place now where it does. And I think for many businesses, this has been the last sort of nudge, the last bit of need to know, actually, if that's the case, if this is going to help business success, we really can't ignore this. On the other hand, regulations have increased the expectation on a regulation and compliance around ED&I related. So whether it's the Equality Act, which has been around since 2010, so we've always had kind of an obligation to uphold that, but we're moving away from the compliance perspective. We're now looking at, okay, it's not just about that baseline requirement. We recognize the value for the business in valuing our people, in seeing them more in their individuality. Again, part of the well-being piece, ensuring that they're happy in the workplace. Can they bring themselves to work without having to mask themselves or elements of themselves, without trying to juggle challenges, whether they're personal or related to the way that they work at work, on their own. So I think we're seeing that shift happen in professional services. I think one of the differences with some of the other organizations, such as corporates, is the capacity, the extra capacity the corporations have to do things that are, for us in a professional services, non-fee paying. So we have that challenge in our space where, there are lots of things on top of that fee paying role, whether it's your technical skills training, whether it's your induction when you get here, and it can feel like an ED&I workshop or something to do with ED&I is on top of that. So it might be, I don't know, haven't got research for this, but there might be some reluctance to have taken on ED&I to do with capacity. Do we have the capacity for it? Do we have the investment for it? Professional services now are in a place where they know they can't ignore it. It is a benefit to the business, and the challenges, as we'll talk about a bit later, I guess, will be around, well, how then do we take ED&I forward in that context? Safri is part of ICAW, and they've been doing work around ED&I for a while, producing some really great resources. And one of their initiatives, Rise, which is working with schools in low socioeconomic areas, and their members, such as Safri, go in to volunteer, work with Year 10 students on soft skills, and they're looking to expand and invest in that initiative. And that's just one example of where we really are getting on board this now, on what it looks like, not just on improving diversity within, improving an inclusive culture within, but looking at the impact of that on society in the areas where we work. So it's that kind of equality piece. So yeah, seeing all these different shifts, and I think it's not, often these things can be initiated or driven by the regulation side of things, but it's really encouraging to see how leadership and professional services are getting more on board the moral case as much as anything else.
Yeah, and I think you referenced the fact that that people had to have a baseline because there were things like the Equality Act, etc., etc. There's employment law in place that has probably given that baseline. However, as you referenced, you've got McKinsey research, you've probably got loads of data out there now that says that actually we could be attracting better people, we could be attracting better clients. Effectively, all of these different things come together to give us a more profitable organization, which I think for any managing partner running a professional services firm are all positives. So it's not unreasonable to think that actually having an ED&I strategy is got to be the next step then, because that should sit within your whole firm strategy. So could you just talk us through the sort of key elements effectively of putting together an ED&I strategy? What the key things that a professional services business should be thinking about when trying to set a strategy?
Yeah, I think prior to a strategy, you've got that kind of, I think a lot of businesses are still in a place where the ED&I work is quite ad hoc, where you've got sort of interested parties trying to sort of take it forward. And on the other hand, you've got the kind of business case emerging more strongly. And also, you're talking about the research broadly, lots of research around the lack of diversity within our sector, within accountancy. And so all of that is kind of making that big case for us taking this work forward. And to be able to do that well, you need to say, okay, well, who are we? Where are we at? What's our baseline report look like? What does our diversity look like? And where do we want to get to within that? So sometimes there's a danger that the messaging is we just want more diversity all of the time everywhere, and that doesn't really tell you anything, and it certainly doesn't help you achieve any of that as an outcome, because, well, where do we start? Where's our deficit, our diversity deficits, for example? So at Safri, when I joined, one of the first things was doing that baseline report, pulling the data, saying what does our ethnicity makeup look like? What does our gender balance look like? Those are the data points that we could look at here for lots of businesses, and we're not alone in this at Safri. Data can be one of the barriers to really understanding your context well, and it's something I think a lot of people are trying to improve on more and more as they recognize the value of drawing on data. I think a strategy built on data has got a bit more of a foundation to it. You can then say, okay, well, these are the gaps, and actually this is where we're doing better than we thought. And we found at Safri that was certainly the case. I mean, you could look around and say, oh yeah, there's gender balance does feel quite good, but perhaps the partnership's not necessarily reflecting that. But when you actually look at the data, we had 50-50 gender balance across almost all of our cohorts. And that included director, senior manager level. So at a senior level, we had a 50-50 gender balance, which was brilliant. And even in the partnership, a 37% female representation is pretty good. So there was actually a really nice story to tell and say, look, this is a strength we're building on. Let's try and retain that. Let's keep looking at gender equality and experience in the workplace. But setting those targets and understanding, well, what does good look like is an important part of creating your strategy. So understanding your sector, what's a realistic expectation given the pipeline, given the context that we work within. So I was drawing on the FTSE Women Leaders Review, I was looking at the Parker Review, Social Mobility Commission, and looking at the City of London's Breaking the Class Barrier report. So I was drawing on these different pieces of research and benchmarks as a way to understand what's realistic for, not for me, but what's realistic for us at Safri to ask of ourselves in the next 3 years. What could that look like? So drawing on those benchmarks, understanding what our baseline looks like, and making sure that we didn't just sit with some targets, which inevitably I think leads to kind of a tick box exercise type mentality. I made sure that inclusion was one of those 3 pillars that we have. It's really central to what we do. If you're not looking at your culture and how to make a culture more inclusive, then you might as well not have the targets, I think, because it's just can set you off on the wrong path. You need to be looking at an inclusive culture at the same time as looking at, well, what would a more diverse workplace look like for us, and what are we trying to achieve? So I'd say that's kind of the basics, if you like, of putting your strategy together, making sure there's a narrative around it, that the why is really clear. Why is it important for your business to be looking at diversity inclusion? Have that at the outset and create sort of a language almost around ED&I, particularly if you're working in a place that hasn't really talked about or looked at or engaged with ED&I. A lot of the terminology is going to be quite new. It might feel quite alien. It might feel quite threatening to some people, particularly if it's being misunderstood. So I think developing sort of the discourse, the language around ED&I, how do you want people to approach it, understand it, see how it fits into their day-to-day work? I think it's all really important. Your strategy will only take you so far. And I know you haven't asked this, but I'm going to segue very smoothly into talking about the human part of all of this work. I think strategy really has to be balanced with the human and a realistic idea of how inclusion and equality is actually achieved. It's rarely a linear process. And the how you move towards inclusion and equality is as important as the goal. I think that's a really important thing to remember in all of this. And, by inclusion, we're not talking about assimilating people, which just leaves you with the status quo. It leaves you with those underrepresented groups still kind of adjusting themselves to fit in. Even if you've made it easy to fit in, they're still having to do that. Really, you're looking at understanding, well, what is the status quo? What are the power dynamics at play here that produce those inequalities to start with? What's our underlying culture, really, the underlying culture of the business? And is difference valued here? Whether that's cultural difference, whether it's identity based, or in the way that people's brains are wired, are those differences valued, and the perspectives that they will bring to the table, are they valued here? So that human interaction and understanding is really important. And within that diversity, I think it is important to find the common thread then. Where are our commonalities? Where do we connect? So by getting to know each other, sounds like really basic stuff, doesn't it? Just getting to know each other, understand the people in your team, find something that you perhaps have in common, is going to help take us beyond some of those initial feelings that we might have of fear of difference, fear of the unfamiliar in that other person in your team. And so when we can go beyond those and we can connect with someone, we're starting to build that space of psychological safety where you can start to have difficult conversations where they might need to arise. Yeah, I think we need to create spaces that where there is psychological safety. So people feel they can bring different points of view to the table, because that's where we're going to get innovation at the end of the day. And that does require people being honest and more open about themselves, perhaps in a personal capacity, with perhaps what's going on at home, or just how they prefer to work. We need to be able to share sort of the whole of ourselves in the workplace, really. And I guess perhaps as a last point, it just comes to mind that sometimes we can operate in this false binary of the diverse people on one side and then the non-diverse people on the other, where the non-diverse gets understood as all the white straight men. And this type of thinking kind of comes about if we don't learn to see the complexity within each person, that everyone has a story to tell, that in different contexts we might experience marginalization and in one moment, but in a different context we might be the one exercising privilege and power. And having that self-awareness on where you do have privilege, where you do have power, how you can leverage that for the good of inclusion and for equality is important. So getting beyond that false binary, it's not like that. That shouldn't be how we understand things. It's not the diverse on one side and the non-diverse on the other. We should try and understand everyone in their complexity. And in this, and in our sort of desire for diversity and understanding all that complexity and trying to progress towards a more inclusive culture, we really mustn't sacrifice each other for the sake of that progress. I think that comes back to the point around, the how we try and achieve ED&I. Yes, we want to have a strategy in place. Yeah, we want to know what best practice looks like. Yeah, we want to achieve and be successful. We want the best for everybody. But sometimes that can default into a sort of a siloed approach. We can start saying, okay, if we're going to be strategic, it means we need to prioritize this group of people. We need to understand this group is experience this type of marginalization or discrimination more than another group. And that analysis is important because of socio-political history. It is the case that certain groups, different characteristics, different life experiences do mean certain people, certain groups experience disadvantage in particular ways. We have to recognize that power differential. But in all of that, we have to move forward together.
You don't want to alienate different groups, do you? I suppose there's a risk, there's a real risk that you do that by, sort of taking a siloed approach, focusing on one group.
Yeah, I think that's where intersectionality, I know it sounds like a buzzword sometimes, but that intersectional approach really matters in this. I think if you start sort of splitting people off into groups, where then you end up having this kind of straight white male alienated other, in the corner, that's not going to take you forward. And again, it's not recognizing that in that group, people do have their stories to tell it, and it's a mythical group. It's something which we sort of are creating in our minds. You can talk about a dominant group in a place of work. You could do your baseline report and you can say, look, we have this type of person is very much overrepresented here. This type of person very much has a voice here. They take up leadership positions. Therefore, they're calling the shots. They're doing the decision making. and we want to redress that. We want to bring in some more diversity to make sure that we've got different perspectives. Like, that's okay to do that analysis, but I think it's always approaching each person, every person in that scenario with compassion, with an understanding of how any type of initiatives that are trying to redress a lack of diversity and create inclusion might trigger worry in some people if they feel that they're the ones who don't bring that added value. And again, it's a perception that they don't. So I think it can be a tricky space to work in sometimes. I think a lot of discernment is necessary on everybody's part. And I've just come out of a leadership training, actually, where we were talking about the value of pausing, just taking that moment to step back and just to discern and understand what's in front of you. And you know, the trainer at the time was sort of talking about it in the case of someone's come to you with a problem, you're the manager, you're the leader. What do? Do you react, or do you take a moment? And it works in that context, but I was thinking from an ED&I perspective as well. How often do we sort of base our actions on those immediate sort of gut feelings that we have towards someone, on those assumptions that we have? How often do we take a moment to challenge some of those assumptions and actually think what's better in the long term here? And even if what that person said I didn't like, I don't agree with what they've said, what's the best way to address those differences of opinion? Yeah, and it's up to a business to set up a space, to create those spaces, to have difficult conversations, to understand where are the red lines, where's the grey space where we're willing to work with the discomfort, and where do we want to get.
Okay, so following on from what you're saying there, in a sort of similar vein, one of the key differences between a professional practice, I always think, and a corporate is probably the number of management stakeholders. So, and what I mean by that is a corporate has a C-suite, and that C-suite will be responsible for setting the strategy, and they're responsible probably to shareholders, but at quite a distance, because those shareholders probably don't work in the business, compared to a managing partner, maybe a management board, depending on how they are set up. But ultimately, you could have 2 partners, you could have 100 partners, all with an opinion, a view on how the business should be taken forward. And I think this is where it's quite challenging, I think, on the ED&I side, because you are bringing something new to a wide and an intergenerational group as well, with lots of different experiences, and trying to get everyone rallying around the same strategy can sometimes be quite challenging. So what are your views on that in terms of trying to move an ED&I strategy forward?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? I think it's something I'm still working out, I have to say, having been working in the professional services for only a year and 9 months. Getting my head around that, I think it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, you know, in a corporate setting where you've had a strategy signed off and everyone must fall into line, it almost feels like the dream, because then everyone has to get behind something. But actually, a carrot and stick approach with ED&I, as with many things, but certainly with ED&I, I wouldn't say is the most effective approach anyway. There's a lot of argument around whether, or debate, if you like, around whether ED&I trainings, or, you know, ED&I related trainings ought to be mandatory, because it can create sort of backlash. I think the role of a partner in a partnership setting is interesting. I think if people, again, I think there's on the part of whoever you've got in, whether that's one person, sort of in my instance, or a team of ED&I specialists, there's some responsibility, I think, on our roles to keep on making that business case, if you like, and helping people to understand the why from both the business case side and the moral case side of it. So it's not just about keep on about the bottom line. I think there's people are motivated by the thought that being more diverse and certainly more inclusive is the right thing to do. It helps people to be happier in the workplace. It helps to build a more equal society. A lot of people want to get behind that agenda, if you like. But I think with the partnership, actually it comes down to, again, the culture that already exists in a business, the types of training partners get around how to be a leader, because they can be technically brilliant at what they do, and that's how they've got to that role in the partnership. But if there isn't training around what it's like to lead a team, what it's like to make sure that team will feel they've got a voice, that they feel empowered, that they feel they have some autonomy, that they feel valued, then it's not only bad for business, it's not helping you to achieve that inclusive culture. So there's quite a bit around inclusive leadership at the moment. And I think integrating that approach into our leadership trainings, or even having that as the leadership training, I think has a lot of value. You might not even hear the acronym ED&I, and sometimes that's, that is often fine, and sometimes it's preferable, because we don't want to get kind of caught up in ED&I as if it's this very separate thing, very separate area of work. It's often rooted in just really good leadership practice.
Taking that to a next step, effectively what we are saying, and what I think you believe and I believe, is that the role of the partner in, I want to say, an ED&I strategy, but actually moving it away from a strategy just to how to run your business and your practice, the tone of your leadership, the way you go about conducting yourself, your relationship with your teams, your clients, is really, really important to be able to demonstrate and live out those behaviours. Because I think I always worry with this sort of thing, that, and I'm very conscious of this, that we say one thing in a strategy, that a partnership is responsible for delivering, and the partners are responsible for delivering that, but actually we're sort of living something completely different. And I think in my position, I find that is particularly challenging on recruitment and retention of staff, because my biggest fear is that someone leaves the business and they call us out on that, or not even leave the business, that they are able to call us out on the fact that we are saying one thing and we're not living it. And I think the partners are probably the biggest part of that, because they have to demonstrate that they're bought into it, they believe in it, and they want to deliver it. So there's no real question in there, but that's kind of my views on, I think, where the partners are important.
Yeah, they are really important. I think partners, senior leaders in a business, I think whether you're talking about a corporation or professional services, perhaps even more so professional services, where the partner has a particular type of status, real and perceived, then their backing of something really makes a difference. And there's almost this invisible rubber stamp, I think, that exists on, if you're trying to put on an awareness raising initiative through to signing off your strategy, if something has got explicit partner backing, then it's going to land more strongly, better in the business. So you might have an external speaker coming for Black History Month or Social Mobility Awareness Day, and if you can have a partner, somebody senior, to sort of introduce that person who can promote that event, you're likely to see more take up. That's reality. So I think there's a role for partners in terms of showing an explicit support, championing, sponsoring ED&I initiatives. Some approaches, you see this more in corporations, I think, where people in the C-suites are assigned a different diversity area, let's say, and they are the sponsor of that. Somewhere like Grant Thornton, I think, has done this really well. They've had sponsors for each of their diversity areas, each of their employee resource groups. We call them people networks here at Safri. And I think that makes a big difference, because it's showing that you've got somebody in a very senior position who is valuing that work, who is willing to give their time. And I know time is limited, they're very time poor, but actually to be able to offer some of their time, some of their knowledge about how the business works and how to leverage and bring about change, can go a long way. So I think partners and senior leaders do have an important role in sort of sponsoring and being champions of ED&I work going forward. And I think people within partnerships, within the partnership, within senior leader roles, who are perhaps from an underrepresented group themselves, their presence in that space, they are then role models to others, whether they choose to sponsor, champion different areas of work, I think is a very personal decision and should be that personal decision. Some people might say they have an obligation or responsibility, but I think given that they've got to that place, and they may well have faced more barriers than others getting there, and they may still be facing more barriers than others in remaining in that role, I think we have to be careful we don't sort of then assign this kind of additional responsibility just because they're part of a particular underrepresented group. But I think them just carrying out and being successful in their roles is enough, and I think that's in itself a signal to others that might be thinking they'd never even imagined being in a senior role themselves, and then they see someone who has a similar background to them or a similar challenge to them or looks like them, and it can be really encouraging to others in the business.
Yeah, and we've recently done some work, haven't we, around some really good video content, effectively, that we've been able to deliver to the national firm from various different groups within our business, that I would say have been probably the most powerful. It's most powerful sort of messaging, effectively, on what it's like to work at Safri, and that you can be from an underrepresented group and still have a successful career here and enjoy your time working here. And I think that's been quite powerful, I think, for me, and hopefully it has been for other people working here.
Yeah, it's really encouraging that we've been able to draw on real people's experiences at Safri to develop both our ED&I video, You Belong, as well as our new EVP video. They were both built on genuine conversations and research with our colleagues, and I feel they've got real integrity as a result. And our Great Place to Work survey as well, it was coming out really positive that this is a great place to work for a lot of people. It's indicating that there's a fairly good, really good inclusive culture. But we know there's still work to do. We know there's diversity deficits, and it might well be that as we become more of a diverse place, we see or we hear about where more people have challenges, because obviously if you have a dominant group all getting on and feeling included, that's only affirming that the dominant group are included in their own space. So until you have real diversity, and then you have a survey that tells you we feel really included, only then can you start to really know that you're doing the right thing, that you have redressed certain barriers, or very implicit, very sort of not intended, but often we build into our recruitment processes, we build into the way that we work discrimination without even thinking about it. When we do it, it's sort of designed in, which is why that strategy, the strategic process, that approach where you're actually looking at the design of a place. How have we designed Safri? What is it to work here? What mechanisms do people go through to access professional development opportunities? What's our performance review look like in practice, and our promotion and succession in practice? Once you start drilling down into those mechanisms and understanding, are particular groups experiencing them differently? We can't know.
I'm going to call us to an end there, because it's been fascinating to hear, I suppose, firstly, where professional services businesses are on the sort of ED&I journey, the importance of a strategy. But I think where we finish there is that the strategy is never going to be done, probably. There's always going to be things. It's a journey, and there isn't an end point as such. I don't think it's going to continue to evolve, and it's something that everyone's going to have to continue really focusing on and bed it into the day-to-day and carry on, developing the strategy, the way people feel about coming to work, and making sure that we are getting the best out of all the people that we work alongside. And so I think there's lots to take away there for people listening to this podcast. So thank you ever so much for making the time to talk to me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. And I think in the long term, it is integrating what at the moment might be a separate ED&I strategy into, the business strategies, into the ESG frameworks that people are developing.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a long-term process to this, isn't there? But I think today it's been really interesting just to reflect back on those early stages and the first steps at getting ED&I going in a professional services place.
Yeah, definitely. An exciting time, I think. So thank you very much. So Safri provide a range of tax, compliance and business advisory services to professional practices and financial services specialists. So if you'd like to find out more about how we could help you or your business, then please visit our website at www.safri.com. Thank you for listening today.